And good afternoon, everyone. Charles Moskowitz. Thanks for joining me. My guest is Scott Shepard. Scott, the name of your group?
It's the National Center for Public Policy Research.
Okay, and give us a quick thumbnail on what you guys do over there. What do you research?
Right. Well, I am the deputy director of the Free Enterprise Project. What we do at the Free Enterprise Project is square off against a much better funded and much larger organization of groups on the left that are working to push and fairly successfully right now, working to push corporate America to the far left in the same way that it's pushed Hollywood and higher education, the American Academy, in that direction, in an effort to push all of American culture, all of American economic life into the left lane and push everybody who has different thoughts about the world more or less out of economic life in the same way that they've been pushed out of the academy, out of cultural production in the country.
Now, in the case of corporate influence, these groups, and I think that we could say that the main one right now is a shadowy network of groups that go under the title Black Lives Matter. They are using very coercive tactics to get corporations to shake them down for money and to get public support. And, in other words, if you don't support this shadowy group called Black Lives Matter, then you have something against black people, and nobody wants to be accused of that. Who is Black Lives Matter anyway?
Well, it's becoming clearer and clearer that Black Lives Matter is another one of these organizations. International Answer was one about a decade ago. We see these pop up again and again, as you say, shadowy organizations that have explicitly, as we're finding out more and more every day, explicitly Marxist principles. The leaders of Black Lives Matter have been on CNN and other places saying, look, we're Marxists. This is what we want to achieve. We want to achieve world socialism, and we want to do it by any means necessary. And there's a sister organization that's called By Any Means Necessary. Bam. And so we know what they're after. We know what they want, but they play. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, probably a number of years ago now, somebody was talking about Jon Stewart's show on Comedy Central. And he said, Jon Stewart plays this game of clown nose on, clown nose off. He plays a game where he'll say entirely disparaging things about conservatives, about Republicans, about anybody on the right. And if he's called on it, he'll say, well, I'm just a comedian. I don't have any truth value. I don't have to be correct. But in any other situation, he was patting himself on the back that more young people were getting their news from him than from any mainstream sources. So he would play both sides of the fence. And Black Lives Matters is doing the same thing in a friendly situation. And of course, CNN is a wholly partisan institution these days. There's no question about that. When they're with their friends on CNN, they'll admit that they're active Marxists, and that what they want to achieve is to push America into a group identity, understanding of the world, and to push anybody right of center, anybody with traditional American values right out of play entirely. But then if you mention that, as we've mentioned it to corporations that are supporting Black Lives Matter, the response is, oh no, they don't mean anything like that at all. All they're trying to do is stop police brutality against blacks, which itself is a demonstration of the power of this organization. There is a problem in this country, not a gigantic one, but there's a serious problem in this country with police brutality. It's not, however, directed disproportionately at blacks. There is an immense amount of demonstrated bad behavior, but more of it statistically happens to whites and to non-blacks than to blacks. But that Black Lives Matters, as part of its effort, has been to racialize that issue, and then to call anybody who doesn't support all of their efforts, which they then hide from the public, racist.
Okay, Scott, I may take issue with you on one point, and that is that
Right.
it does target black men particularly, and that those statistics are not really reliable because obviously the black population of the country is only maybe 3%, 2%. So, I mean, sure, more white people are harassed, but there are more, you know, black people targeted. Now, having said that,
Just as a detail, I think it's about 13%. I think the black population.
either way, it's you have to look at a statistic in a context that makes sense. Putting that aside, um, the Black Lives Matter umbrella of groups, I would argue, don't care about Black lives. And when they make people take an oath, almost like they did recently to Vice President Pence on national television, will you say the word Black Lives Matter? You know, I would say that I don't support the Black Lives Matter organization because they don't care about Black lives. If they did, then where were they when almost 100 people were shot dead on one weekend in Chicago recently and in St. Louis, the predominant number of whom were black, including 3 children? Where
Yeah.
were they when, after the George Floyd murder, and I would argue it's a murder, we don't know, we'll let the justice system decide, they were involved with looting black businesses, burning black neighborhoods, killing black people all across the country. So they don't care about black lives. They have a whole different agenda. Now, the group Black Lives Matter also reminds me of Acorn. I don't know if you remember them.
Yeah.
I wrote a book about Acorn a while back, and Acorn was officially stopped once they were exposed by Operation Veritas as being fraudulent. All their public funding was cut off, but they were an interlocking directorate of groups, some public, some private, some businesses, some government agencies. They had the same managers, they had the same personnel. They all worked out of this one gigantic beehive apparently in New Orleans, and they were shaking down people from left to right every year. Every election they were accused of voter fraud on a massive scale. They were trying to, carry out the directives of Cloward and Piven, who wrote a very famous essay in the 60s, published by Nation magazine, where they said the best way to destroy capitalism, the best way to destroy the American system, is to overwhelm it by having many thousands of women, for example, apply for welfare at the same time, by flooding the voter rolls with fraudulent votes to the extent that they can't handle it any longer. And that was kind of their founding in the late 60s, early 70s. I think Black Lives Matter is similar to that. It reminds me of that. And I think that it's an organization that cries out for an investigation, a criminal investigation.
I think that's certainly right. To answer your earlier, or to respond to your earlier point, where was Black Lives Matter when the discussion arises about so much black on black killing?
Right.
If you've heard about Lee Fang, he's a journalist on the West Coast who wrote a piece in which he just included, as part of his reportage, a discussion with a young black man who said, where is BLM, considering all the black on black crime that's occurring in our neighborhoods? He included that in his story. And the Black Lives Matter's leaders went after him and made him grovel and apologize and go through a struggle session and a renunciation session in the old
communist approach. Yeah.
That's right, in the old Maoist style, in order to keep his job. So what they're doing is actively and aggressively calling racist anyone who brings up concerns that really go to the heart of how most black lives are lost by murder in this country. That's now because it's become racist to bring up the real problem. And it absolutely demonstrates your point that they're not concerned about black lives. They're concerned about stirring up division and dissent.
Well, yeah. I mean, they're clearly using racism, which is a genuine issue in this country, to further their own political agenda and to enrich themselves, to line their own pockets. And I think that we need to stand up to that and say, because we care about black lives and because we believe in law and order, and at the same time we want genuine police reform when it's needed, we want this organization investigated. We want them to be, where's our journalists? They're all cowering in fear. Why aren't they doing investigative stories on this group, that had developed such influence, even internationally, and which is interlocking with other leftist groups of all stripes, including anti-Jewish groups, anti-Semitic groups, anti-Israel groups, radical gay groups. I mean, all kinds of groups, and it's the same beehive of leftist organizations that, in many cases, have nothing to do with each other, but are all working together into this concept of intersectionality.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right, and I think that if anyone were brave enough to do the investigation and research that you're talking about, I suspect you'd see a direct line of support and a direct line of personnel moving from Answer and Acorn in the previous decade to these organizations now. I suspect that they just changed names and changed focus a little bit. Because, as you're pointing out, and is becoming more and more true to what terrifies white Americans most, absolutely most, is being called a racist. And
Oh, yeah, I mean, of course, it's like it can destroy your reputation, it can destroy your career, it could just it's devastating. I mean,
yeah,
it's a terrible, vicious charge to make, and since well, first, since the election of President Trump, who I think we might note had been in public life for over 30 years before running for president, and was never referred to as racist or white supremacist or anything like that, and whose company, the New York Times, actually sent researchers into his company after he announced his find to see if they could discover racism or sexism, and they discovered quite the opposite. They found that
yeah,
his businesses generally promote minorities, particularly women, to very high levels. So they decided not to run the story. They just said,
yeah.
"Okay, nothing here."
They certainly weren't going to reveal the truth that he wasn't these things.
Well,
Right?
now all of a sudden, because he's run as a Republican, as a
Yeah,
conservative, he gets the same label that every Republican going back to Eisenhower has gotten,
that's
basically.
right.
Except in the case of Trump, it's much worse because Trump is much more sincere and true about his conservative agenda and
Yeah,
values, which he ran on. He actually means it. So they're absolutely not, now it's reached a fever pitch. And what I would suggest to liberals as well as conservatives is that when Trump steps up and pays no attention to this kind of a vicious, politically correct tyranny, he's doing all of us a favor. He's taking on what is an informal tyranny where we're all frightened, we're all cowering in fear because such charges can destroy a person.
yeah. Well, and I think that we're going to have to recognize and fight the ability of that charge to destroy people. Because if you look at these these claims of white supremacy and the claims of white fragility and the claims of multi-generational white guilt for previous white supremacy, all of us under the Black Lives Matters theories and the intersectional theories that are at the heart of this movement, all white people are from birth uh, uh, assigned the fact of white privilege that they can never overcome, but they have to constantly apologize for the whole of their lives, and are constantly racist. So all you can do is, as a white person, is mitigate your privilege, mitigate your racism, but you're always susceptible at any time to the charge of racism. So we're just going to have to say, look, that's not an acceptable definition of racism. Any one-way definition that makes one group of people entirely susceptible to the claim at any time for any reason and allows them no defense except to grovel is not a social interaction paradigm that any of us can agree to or participate in. And so claims made on that basis just have to be rejected. Just have to be.
Oh, absolutely. And
Yeah,
and I think that, look, I mean, obviously, such charges are based on some truth in that this society has been a white supremacist society up until maybe World War II when it really started to change. And with the Civil Rights Act of 1965, it changed further. And as a result, it really no longer is. I mean, I think that we need to turn the tables and point out who the real racists are, who are perpetrating problems for the Black community. It's leftist ideas, starting with the so-called war on poverty and the implementation of groups like Acorn and others that have hurt Black business, They've hurt black enterprise. They've hurt the black family with their big federal welfare programs that pay women to get rid of their men and then have children out of wedlock. They've hurt black education with their gigantic, factory schools that don't teach phonics and don't teach methods to read, so that black children are illiterate. My good friend, the late Sam Blumenfeld, wrote a lot about this, and he researched the number of black men in prison who are illiterate, and it's very high. They didn't learn reading because they were mistaught as children in these big government-run, predominantly liberal left-run schools.
Yep.
Meanwhile, President Trump wants to give tax credits for these children to get out of those schools.
That's right.
Said so in the speech in Tulsa, which the media didn't want to report, and said they'd rather talk about how many numbers of people were there. We could talk about how they destroyed the black church by bribing black ministers to allow abortion clinics to be built in black neighborhoods during Margaret Sanger's time in the 1930s. It's called the Negro Project. I mean, let's talk about who's racist. Let's talk about who has had policies that have hurt the black community.
Well, I think that that's right, and I don't think that this is a particularly new critique. Patrick Moynihan was writing about these sorts of things, critiquing the Great Society and what the effects it was having in the black community within 4 years of the beginning of the Great Society, before Johnson had even been trundled back to Texas for his ill-gotten reward. He was pointing these things out, and we talk about the logic. The logic that underscores any thoughts of defunding police. What's really at the heart of keeping bad police are the police unions. What we ought to be talking about is decommissioning the police unions and setting up stronger internal investigation and internal relations offices within the police, and being able to get rid of bad police. It's the police unions that protect the bad police, and it's the bad police that create the trouble, and particularly the trouble in over-policed communities, or heavily policed communities, black communities. But by that same logic, the underlying failure of education in black communities arises from the teachers union, arises from the fact that the teachers union plays the same role, the same worst teachers, and leaves them in classrooms rather than getting rid of them, rather than making them to the same battery of tests that students are expected to stand up to these days and show their competencies. So if we want to defund and decommission, let's get rid of the police union, let's get rid of the teachers union, and let's get to the heart of why there is a pull toward criminalization and a pull away from education in these communities. Now, I would add that we ought to decriminalize that. As a libertarian at heart, I think that the drug war has a lot to do with tearing.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Well, and I would say that a lot of drug activity ought to be decriminalized and pulled out of and that area of violence and discord could be greatly alleviated as well. But there are all sorts of solutions that are available that the left isn't thinking about and talking about.
No, because they own that stuff. That's their bread and butter. I mean, public unions.
Yep.
You saw what happened when Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin took on the public unions. It was like sticking a pole in a hornet's nest, and he won. He got rid of them in Wisconsin, and the result is that the state is much better managed, better off. Prices went down for municipalities. Insurance costs went down. You didn't have this rotten, corrupt public union. And again, I'm not against unions. Private unions are fine. It's public unions that create a conflict of interest, a double jeopardy. And, we talked about how leftism has hurt the black community literally through their rotten policies, and spiritually as well. Eventually, you have a situation where, because of their anti-business policies, because of their other policies, because of their anti-family policies, you've got black boys growing up in neighborhoods where they don't have fathers, and there's no employment, and there's nothing to do. So there is going to be a rise in crime rates. And the only really final arbiter for all of this are the police. The police are there as the last resort, trying to defend neighborhoods where 95% of the people are trying to get to work, trying to avoid drug gangs. And they're now under attack with this absurd idea that they're going to be removed and you're going to have complete anarchy as a result. If anyone questions that, take a look at Chaz Chop or whatever they're calling it
Yeah.
in Seattle. There's already been a second shooting today, and there's thugs going around and terrorizing people, and there's rape and there's murder and it's complete discord at night. So, that's the lost line of defense, and they want to take that away. And this is what Black Lives Matter views as a good idea for Black communities and Black people? I don't think so.
Getting back to your point, that's another illustration that this isn't a movement that's about Black lives. It's about discord, because it's illegitimate and racist to bring up the fact that 94% of Black murders of Black people, are perpetuated by Black people. You're not allowed to mention that, even though that's where that locus of Black lives has to be saved, because it's where it's involved. Similarly, we have to pretend, for fear that we be called racist, that defunding the police is a kindness and a favor to Black lives and to Black communities. But as you say, this would make hostages of the vast majority of Blacks in these neighborhoods, because we can reform policing, but we can't end policing in neighborhoods that are notoriously violent, because that will put hostage, that'll hold to ransom absolutely everybody else in that neighborhood who needs the police to protect them.
And now, of course, it's the usual ignorant and superficial answer to racism. Rather than address the problems we've talked about, the actual policies that have hurt Black communities, have hurt Black people, their idea of addressing racism is to rip the black face off of the maple syrup jar.
Yeah.
To deface the Shaw Memorial across the street from Massachusetts State House, which actually was put there in dedication to a Black regiment who fought for Massachusetts in the Civil War, or to destroy a statue of Ulysses S. Grant. Last I checked, he was on the right side of the conflict.
I find all of this statue demolishing astonishing and frustrating. What we need to keep in mind in this process, racism is a bad thing, and slavery was a bad thing. They're not the only bad things that have happened in the world before. And given the nature of human beings, that everyone is flawed, and the nature of human beings march through history, which is to say that later generations will have different values and consider different things important and genuine than previous generations. If we are going to tear down the statues of everybody who believed or committed things during their lives that we now find unsavory, we have to take down all statues, and we can't replace them with anything, because it's just going to be a waste of money, because future generations will, of course and of necessity, have different value set than we have now. And so by their lights, everyone who existed before will have done something that they will look at as tawdry or inappropriate. So there can't be statues anymore. Nothing can be named after anybody.
Well, I mean, it's a culture comp. They're trying to destroy American identity, American culture. We'll start looking like East Germany if they keep it up. Everything is going to become gray. And what I would counter with is, if they want to start tearing down statues, let's go after any memorial that supports someone who supported communism, which is responsible for the murders of, I think, 100 million people around the world. Let's get rid of Margaret Sanger. Let's get rid of, these leftist icons who are supporting a philosophy and an agenda that was at least as evil as slavery, and in fact was slavery in the literal sense.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, we've got to shut down the New York Times as well, because the New York Times accepted a Pulitzer Prize for Walter Duranty, and he spent all those years lying about the murder of tens of millions of Ukrainians, the enslavement of an entire 18 nations.
Yeah.
And how many?
That Pulitzer Prize is still on the wall in the New York Times headquarters.
That's right. That's right. So if we're going to do this clean sweep, we've got to clean out everything. If we're going to rename, I mean, I love the Yale controversy. If they're not going to rename Yale, we shouldn't change the name of anything at all.
And, if they are going to rename Yale, they're going to have to recall all of those degrees and change the name on them. And they're
That's
going to
right.
have to.
That's right, because they are by their own logic, they are perpetuating slaveholding and they're perpetuating institutions of evil. And the triggering effect of seeing that name is so profound that they have to dip into their billions of untaxed endowment to rectify that evil.
So, Scott, what else are you guys working on over there?
Well, we're getting to the end of shareholder season, so we've made our proposals for the year. We've fought the good fight. We've tried to plant questions, or not plant questions, but ask questions of the corporate leaders, including in these last meetings at the end of the year and the MasterCard meeting that I know that you saw some of our activity in, asking these companies that are explicitly supporting Black Lives Matters, do you understand that these are positions that they hold? And do you support all of these positions as well? Or are you just trying to do the usual PR thing, but you are a little too aggressive in capitalizing the B, the L, and the M in saying that Black Lives Matter? Which is it? And the responses we get are these fumbling, halting, absolute confusion about what it is that they thought they meant or that they were going for, even when you find out that organizations like MasterCard are donating all sorts of money, not necessarily to the Black Lives Matters organization, but to other, as you were talking about earlier, allied organizations, in order to fund further aggressive efforts to sow discord and to break down American society. So now that the season is over, we're going to be looking at ways that we can help those who are being pushed out of American lives and being silenced in corporations and being forced to participate in these struggle sessions at corporations, how to give them a voice and how to start ensuring that viewpoint diversity is protected the way that surface characteristic diversity is being protected in corporations.
All right, Scott, listen, I want to thank you for joining me. I hope that Black Lives Matter is investigated. Corporations are spineless, most of them. They're just worried about their image. They don't want to have boycotts, and they crumble very quickly under this kind of pressure. So I think that the best antiseptic to that is simply getting out the truth, one person at a time, trying to use the media to the degree we're not censored to the best we can, and to sort of bring about kind of a shift in understanding here that ultimately can't be avoided because of critical mass. Anyway, Scott, again, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon.